Recently, Jidenna did an interview with the Breakfast Club, and he had some really interesting thoughts about Pan-Africanism, wisdom he learned from his father. So I wanted to speak on some of those thoughts and its value for us today, and use ancient African history as a guideline. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And as always, if you want to support the Home Team, you can do so on patreon.com. I have some new rewards for you guys, so be sure to check that out. Also, go to Afrographics.com, a website where you can find unique illustrative infographics summarizing African history. All links to Patreon, Afrographics, and Home Team merchandise are in the description box below. Before we begin, it's important to understand that I'm not using Jidenna as any sort of standard or model for this conversation. In general, we shouldn't at all be outsourcing leadership responsibility to celebrities or even black elites. That should come from the ground up. What I am doing is using key points from Jidenna's interview and using that to add my own narrative. So hopefully that makes sense. If you haven't seen Jidenna's interview on the Breakfast Club, I encourage you guys to check it out because I think his interview has some really good insight into one of the ways we in the diaspora can move forward as a unit. Sometimes as a community, we can feel really small, and I think Jidenna gave us a good reminder about that not being the case. He says that his travels to Africa has really empowered him and made him feel as though he wasn't a minority. He speaks to the fact that we have to stop seeing ourselves as a minority and pull from each other's resources, globalizing our agency. The main message Jidenna was getting across as it relates to Pan-Africanism was that Pan-Africanism is a two-way street. And I couldn't agree more. Some of the problems we've encountered with Pan-Africanism is a concern of one group carrying the full weight of Pan-Africanism. A common critique is that other communities aren't loud enough, at least not on a collective level. Whether these reasons are due to a lack of platform or any other reason doesn't really matter because that feeling remains. That's why I'm glad that Jidenna alluded to this by telling us about his father, a Nigerian who introduced him to a healthy understanding of Pan-Africanism. Jidenna's father explained his idea of Pan-Africanism through metaphor. He said that you can't inflate a balloon from inside the balloon. You must inflate it from the outside. In other words, as Jidenna put it, the diaspora must take resources from the outside and put it in, while the continent must take resources from the inside and put it out. The reason why this is so powerful and helpful is because it gives Africa the responsibility for taking care of its children, and through this, the children, or us in the diaspora, can pour back into ourselves and the continent as a whole. Now I'm biased because I'm from the diaspora myself, and the lack of communication and cooperation between the diaspora and the continent can be a little overwhelming. But there are many Africans who see this issue, as did Jidenna's father, and I'm glad he articulated it in such a creative way. Now, what does this have to do with African history? Well, historically, Pan-Africanism didn't really exist in Africa, and that is one of the primary reasons the continent was swallowed up so easily during colonialism. Each ethnic group in Africa, for the most part, only accommodated and advanced their own needs and concerns. That's one of the reasons why the slave trade flourished. Two examples of this would be the Portuguese partnering up with the Mangala to terrorize and enslave the Mbundu and Bakongo peoples of the Congo Empire, and Ahmed Baba of the Songhai Empire, one of the most prolific and influential scholars of Timbuktu, writing a deposition on which African ethnic groups can be enslaved, while conveniently excluding his own. In fact, there were only two semi-concrete examples of Pan-Africanism before colonialism. I say semi-concrete because arguments can be made against these examples, but at the end of the day, there was some form of unity. These examples include when various Ethiopian ethnic groups joined together to defeat the Italians, and 25th Dynasty Egypt. And I want to focus on 25th Dynasty Egypt because it was perhaps the purest form of Pan-Africanism that we really had in ancient Africa, and we may be able to use it as a model for us today. The 25th dynasty was a period in Nile Valley history where the Kushites conquered Egypt. Now on paper, that does not at all sound like Pan-Africanism, but let me explain. Ancient Nubia was located just south of Egypt, Most scholars agree that the Nubians and the Egyptians were closely related people who shared a similar culture, history, and religion, which we can refer to as Nile Valley culture. One particular Nubian group, called the Kushites, felt as though Egypt lost her way, with the culture and the religion being adulterated by foreigners. So they did something that has never really been done in world history. They went up into Egypt, conquered it, and instead of destroying it, they literally restored the culture, the religion, and even rejuvenated the economy with various building projects. Kushite pharaohs forgave their enemies and even gave them positions of power, which is very rare in ancient times. Some scholars call this period the African Renaissance. This moment in African history was probably the most genuine form of Pan-Africanism in ancient Africa. Now, going back to the metaphor Jidenna's father was using about Pan-Africanism concerning the two-way street, this model reached its zenith during the reign of King Taharqa. Most people don't take this angle with the Kushite dynasty of Egypt, but if it weren't for the consistent cooperation of the Egyptians, Kushite rule would have been very different. During the rule of Taharqa, the Assyrians were gaining much power in the north and took over northern Egypt for quite some time. The Egyptians, however, despite Taharqa's struggle to solidify his rule in Egypt, still considered him to be their ruler, and so they revolted against the Assyrians in the north, showing their support of Kushite rule. This rebellion was put down by the Assyrians, however, but it revealed something very important to us in the diaspora, and to Taharqa himself. The exchange of information and support from the Egyptians no doubt helped Taharqa keep the Assyrians out of the south and taking over all of Egypt. Assyrian rule over the north at times was ignored, and the priests in the north acknowledged Taharqa as the legitimate ruler of Egypt. We may not think of that as a big deal, but religion was a huge part of your right to rule, especially in those times. We can think of this moment in Nile Valley history as a prime example of the two-way street model. With this example, we can think of Taharqa and the Nubians as the diaspora and Egypt as Africa. But one of the most important things that the Kushites did was to take ownership of Nile Valley culture. The Kushites wanted to restore the culture, the history, and the religion, and they took complete ownership of that idea. Before they did anything else, they did that, owned what they believed to be theirs. Their creation. Just like the Kushites, we in the diaspora must take ownership of our culture and our community. The reason why we speak about the death of hip-hop or other genres we created is because we have not at all taken ownership of it. As foreigners outside of Africa began to corrupt and own Nile Valley culture, so too have people from outside our community taken ownership of our culture. This is why we oftentimes feel our genres don't really reflect our values or worldview. The same thing goes for our communities. Sometimes we feel as though the predominantly black neighborhoods we live in are socially, politically, and economically hostile to us. The reason for that is simply because we don't own them. The Kushites essentially saw the same thing, and their actions led to one of the greatest moments in African history. Even though this history can be used as a model, we still have to be realistic. The Kushites already shared a culture with the Egyptians, and so it was easy for them to identify with one another, at least for that brief time. I think some of the issues with our modern Pan-Africanism is our heavy reliance on the fact that we all come from Africa, and that this is the key to our advancement as a group. Unfortunately, there needs to be a stronger glue that binds us. In my personal opinion, that glue is not what we all may be thinking. The glue that will aid that two-way street model, in my opinion, is empathy and respect. I have to empathize and respect a Nigerian or an Ethiopian's history, culture, and worldview, and they both certainly have to empathize and respect my history, culture, and worldview. Once we have that glue of empathy and respect, I believe that's something we can use to move forward and actually have incentive to share resources and continue communication. In other words, respecting jollof rice does way more for Pan-Africanism than eating it. But I'm interested in hearing what the diaspora thinks of this. Do we believe that this two-way street philosophy is possible and practical? Because I know that some people are a little hesitant to subscribe to that because of our failure to find balance. But definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments. Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help out in its continued production, you can support the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself, remember your ancestors. Peace.